My name is Ben Alberti. I've been at Framingham State since 2003. So I arrived as an adjunct and then became tenure line. Before that, I worked at a university in Argentina for a couple of years, and before that in the UK, in the United Kingdom, where I received my PhD. Well, I'm an archaeologist. My personal interests are archaeology. And the thing about archaeology as a career is that you do it because you love it. So I am interested in the past. So I will spend time in museums, I will spend time at archaeological sites. So my kids, when I take them on holiday, I'm like, come on kids, let's see this archaeological site. And they're like, not another one, Dad. For example, I was in New York at the weekend at a conference and I visited the Met, the Metropolitan Museum, which I like to. But there what I like to do is they have a couple of rooms which are basically they've transported 18th century French salons and hotel rooms to the Met, because they're the Met, where they've reconstructed them. So what I like to do is just stand in the middle of those rooms and kind of absorb the past that is all around me. I mean, I do other things too. I run quite a lot, and I climb, and I do a lot of things with my kids, and above all, I love to travel. Well, I grew up in the north of England, which I don't know if you've been, but it's full of castles and old Roman ruins. So my grandparents spent a lot of time taking us around on the weekends to see these ruins. So what I liked about visiting these places was standing in the middle of, say, a ruined castle and just soaking up the vibe of the ancient world that you get through ancient things, because archaeology in its broadest sense is about the relationship between people and things from the dawn of humanity until now. So when art is something I've always been interested in, and so I almost went to university to study art instead of archaeology, but I didn't, and I eventually did my PhD on the artwork from Bronze Age Crete, which is a large island in Greece, and this artwork's about 3,500 years old, so it's fresco art. So it's on the walls of the Palace of Minos, as it's called, famous from Greek myth. So the artwork there, you can take it two ways. In fact, you can take art in archaeology two ways. On the one hand, it's an illustration of how people live their lives. So it's telling us something about their lives in general. But on the other hand, it's also about how they thought and how they think about their lives. So it's more a conceptual thing. So if you take the artwork from Knossos, for example, the Palace of Knossos, it is telling us that people dressed in great finery, and there are images of people all along the walls of the palace, dressed in sumptuous clothing, and there's also people doing sports like bull leaping. Personally, I wouldn't try it. I'm not sure they actually did it, but they certainly put it on the walls of their buildings. So on the one hand, it's showing us, well, this is what people were doing, potentially. But on the other hand, it's also telling us how they were thinking. So what I was interested in was how the bodies of people were presented. So looking at the bodies in this artwork, you just get one kind of body shape. Even though it looks like male and female are both being presented, you only get one kind of body shape. So there's a reason behind that. You know, the question is, well, why? So it looks like gender, at the very least, was very differently thought about. And you can get at that from the artworks. So I suppose the draw for me, and the thing that keeps me coming back to it, is the mystery. The why are they presenting themselves in this way? So art is illustration, but it's also a very active part of people's kind of everyday life and engagement with their lives. My research has always been on artworks, but my original research projects as a PhD student were about the study of gender. Specifically, I was looking at how you can explore the concept of masculinity through archaeology, And to do that, I incorporated feminist theory and theories of art. I came to the conclusion you can't really study masculinity through archaeology. And then I moved away from the area I was studying, which was in Greece, to Argentina, basically because I got a job in Argentina teaching at the university. I speak Spanish and have known Argentinian archaeologists for a long time. So there I kind of expanded what had been the study of two-dimensional representations in artwork, fresco art, to three-dimensional representations in ceramic artwork. The common theme was still trying to understand bodies using feminist and anthropological theory. So I've stayed with that and I'm still exploring it, but I've also expanded and now I study rock art, particularly in northern New Mexico, where I've been involved in a project with colleagues from Columbia University and other universities, and where I've taken students for a number of years to help with the surveying of the rock art, looking for the rock art in the landscape and finding the smaller pieces of evidence of projectile points and things like that that go along with it. So that's where my research has led me. So I have been an academic most of my adult life. So I went through from undergraduate to PhD at the University of Southampton in England. I then worked in Argentina for a couple of years at a university there, teaching and doing research in northwestern Argentina. I then took a couple of years off and I was a very bad carpenter in Maine, where it gets very cold in the winter, so I decided maybe I'll try academia again. A position was advertised at Framingham State, so I arrived and I taught just a couple of classes on anthropology when I first arrived. Found I liked it. I liked the student body, the challenge of teaching. So I applied for a tenure-line position, which I was given, at which point I started up my research career again. So since then I've done a lot of research on archaeology and art and archaeological theory, so thinking about how we interpret past cultures, often using anthropological theories and other ways of thinking to help me understand my archaeological materials. Good question. So the good thing about archaeology, as you can imagine, is that it's everywhere. So it can take you absolutely everywhere. So in my career, have been to places like, I've done archaeological work in the woodlands of Virginia, in the baking heat of southern Spain, where I've looked at Roman remains, for example. In the Andes of Venezuela, I've done my archaeological work. Northern New Mexico, as I've mentioned, and also northwest Argentina, but also in downtown Washington, D.C., I've done archaeological work. So you can do archaeology absolutely anywhere. Northern New Mexico is a favorite spot of mine. It's very different from northern England, where I grew up. Not the same quantity of rain at all. So I do love to go there. It's a very fascinating landscape, so I suppose that's why I like to do it. But it's also that rock art, for example, is often in fairly inaccessible places. So if you think about northern New Mexico, it's accessible if you can avoid the cacti and the rattlesnakes and stay out of the burning sun. And in northwest Argentina, I've also studied some rock art. And on one occasion, for example, this involved a long trek through a very dry valley to reach a rock art site where there was rumored to be some spectacular rock paintings, right? So in the middle of this valley was a huge boulder. By huge, I mean it was probably 100 feet tall, but it was just stuck out there. There was nothing else around. It had a big crack through the middle, which was interesting because the wind would howl through the middle and make a very interesting sound, which may have attracted people to the place in the first place. But the rock art was at the top. In order to get to the rock art, I found a crack that kind of wound its way up that was slightly larger than a human body. So I wedged myself in this crack and I crawled up it until I got to the rock art. Because I didn't want to fall off, I was wedging myself as far in as I could. So I cracked, I think it was only one rib, it may have been two, whilst attempting not to fall off, traced the rock art, and then wound my way down. So that's my Indiana Jones moment. I do have a few more of those, but it's it always promises you to take you to interesting places. That's one of the wonderful things about archaeology. Well, I share my archaeological work nearly every day when I teach. So through my teaching, I talk about archaeology in general, but I'm always trying to integrate my own research into what I teach because it keeps it interesting and lively. But there are other elements. I mean, archaeology is inherently interesting because it's telling us about our story and often challenging our assumptions about our story. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I teach human origins, which is about the origins of the human species, Homo sapiens, but also our cousins. So there's a couple of things that are always fascinating to students about this. One is that most peoples whose ancestors originated outside of Africa have up to 2% of Neanderthal DNA in them. Which is quite a shocking statistic, and it does. So that's an unusual piece of information that will get students thinking. But a second thing to do with human origins is that people do not realize, but up until relatively recently, 40,000, 100,000 years ago, there were perhaps 7 or 8 different species of humans alive on the planet at the same time. So we would have seen cousins of ours, depending where we lived, wandering around and saying hi to. So this is also, we always assume we were the only ones around for a long time, but in fact it's much more recently that our cousins died out, our human cousins. But in terms of my own work, the thing, when I talk about bodies, and so I talk about my work on gender and bodies, and this is enlightening to students who might think that the way we think about male and female, that binary, that young people are challenging, I'm glad to see. But that is a very modern Western way of thinking about bodies. So we can see through my archaeological work, they can see that there's very different ways of thinking about bodies as being much more androgynous, or bodies as being divided in many more interesting ways. And then my ceramics that I mentioned, in which you see these kind of strange human-like, animal-like, plant-like bodies on the ceramic pots, which are a question mark if you're just thinking that people use their artworks to illustrate nature. It's a question mark until you think, well, how do other people think about nature? So the artwork is important because of what it's illustrating about people's lives, but it's also the details, the way it's different, that is significant to us. So my early work was on Bronze Age Crete, but I've moved on now. So I have 2 research projects. One, which is ongoing and long-term, is in northwestern Argentina. And there I look at ceramics. So these are clay pots, about this big, which are found in often in funerary contexts, so in graves and burials. And these ceramics have body shapes on them. So they look, it's a bit confusing what they actually are. They have elements that are anthropomorphic. They have elements that are like human bodies. But they also have elements that are zoomorphic. So elements of animal bodies, plus plants and things like that. So the question there, of course, is why? The second project I'm involved with is in northern New Mexico. So here with colleagues from Columbia University and Dartmouth College and Toronto University, we're looking at the rock art in the Rio Grande Gorge. So we're looking at it through a long-term perspective. So we've started with the earliest rock art in the area, which is about, perhaps, it's hard to date, but perhaps 8,000 or more years old, all the way up into the present to graffiti left by contemporary tourists and so forth. So in that project, my part of the project is to do with the oldest art, which is the archaic art. So the archaic art has no images of bodies. So quite different from the work I did at Knossos, where I was looking at bodies. What it has, though, is a lot of footprints. So you get human footprints, you get bird prints, and you get deer prints, among other things. And you get these geometric shapes, these kind of squiggles that are engraved and pecked into the rock art. They can be really quite complex. So again, the question is, why present a body in that way? So in terms of what we've found out, the project in general is finding out that different peoples at different periods of time have a very different concept or idea about why do an image, why do art. Now art, as you may well know, is a modern invention. So what I mean by that is the way that we think about art now is a result of Renaissance thinking. So if you think of all the great artists of the Renaissance, like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, or Michelangelo, etc., they were very focused on producing beautiful paintings and sculpture and so forth. And that's when the idea of the genius artist kind of emerged. And that was a very specific point in history. And that's because you had wealthy people, popes and kings, basically saying, come here, I'll pay for all your expenses, paint you some nice pictures. So we have now still this idea that art is about purely an aesthetic thing. It's about the work of some genius who produces some wonderful, beautiful object. But peoples in the past, I doubt, thought about things that way. Now they're interested in making beautiful objects. We all like something that's beautiful. But their idea about what is beautiful and why make that object is quite different. So why would you engrave a rock? It's not just to produce a work of art in our kind of understanding of the work of art. It's also an active part in their daily life. What are they trying to achieve by engraving the rock in the way they do? So why put footprints, right, on a rock surface? So that's telling me a couple of things. It's telling me that they may not have had a concept of a body or an idea about the body that you can then copy and put into a work of art. And they also had a notion that it was the imprint that was left, the kind of trace of a body, that was much more important than the body itself. So that we can tell from studying this artwork.